I'm going to begin by working on the pocket here for Apron D, and the first thing that I need to do is I need to machine stitch 1 inch from the slanted edges of the pocket. So these points here, this point and this point on these sides here, I am going to be stitching 1 inch from the edge. For those of you that have a metric machine, that is 2.5 centimeters from the edge. So I am not going to mark this. I'm just going to go over to my machine and I am going to use the measurements that are right on my machine and just make sure that I stay along those lines. For my machine, that is going to be this very outside marking here. So that's going to be the very last one. Is going to be my 1 inch measurement. So that's what I'm going to make sure that my fabric is lined up with as I'm doing this stitch. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take where I just stitched. So I just stitched right here, and I'm going to take this raw edge and I'm going to fold it over so that it touches that stitching line that I did, and I am just going to go ahead and I'm going to press it so that again that raw edge matches up with that stitching line, and I am going to do that along both of those slanted edges that I just stitched. Okay, now that I have that pressed there on both of those slanted edges, I am going to go ahead and I'm going to fold it one more time, just so that my stitching that I have is right along that edge, and I am going to press this. Once I have both of these pressed, I'm going to go over to my machine and I'm going to do a base stitch. Now a base stitch is just a temporary stitch that's going to hold things in place while we do other things. So we go ahead and we change our stitch length to as long as it will go on my machine. That's going to be a 5. And we don't back stitch. We also want to make sure that we keep our threads long, because we want to be able to easily pull it out later on. So when I go over to my machine, I'll kind of show you how I change my machine and where I need to be stitching. Okay, so I'm over here on my machine and I'm just gonna take and move my length all the way up. Everything else on my machine is going to stay the same. I'm gonna go over here and my needle is going to be in through all of my layers of fabric here, just right along that edge, the inner edge, okay? And I'm not going to back stitch this. I'm gonna do this side and the other side, and keeping those threads nice and long when I'm done. So you can kind of see where I have that needle inserted. I'm just gonna go straight along the edge there, all the way across. Okay, so I had that base stitch done. It's a little bit longer of a stitch, and again, I didn't back stitch and I kept my threads nice and long. Now I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna go do a top stitch. So I'm gonna just stitch right along the top of my fabric, and I am going to do that at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. For those of you with a machine using metric measurements, it's going to be a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So a 3/8 inch seam allowance right along both slanted edges. So I'm going to go do that, and then I will show you how we go about removing that base stitch that we're just using to hold that in place here. Okay, so I have that top stitch done on either one of those slanted sides there. And now I'm gonna just go ahead and remove my base stitch. I did go ahead and I trimmed my threads of my top stitch just so I wouldn't accidentally grab those as I'm trying to remove the base stitch. And how I do this is I just go ahead and with that base stitch, I just grab one of my 2 threads and I just kind of gently pull it out, and it'll kind of start to gather there as you see, but I'm just gonna kind of keep pulling it. And it'll eventually just pull all the way out, and then that other one will just pull right on out as well. Okay, and you can do the same thing on the other side, just grabbing one of the threads and giving it a little tuck. now we're going to work on the rest of the edges of our apron. So we're going to go ahead and with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, we are going to stitch just the upper side here and then both of these sides. Okay, we're not going to do anything with the bottom of the pocket right now, but we're just going to do a 5/8 inch seam allowance on both sides and the top. And those of you with a metric machine, that is going to be a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Okay, now I have that stitching line on those sides, and I'm going to take it, I'm going to turn my fabric so that my stitching line is right along the edge, and I'm just going to press that. And I'm going to do this on both sides and along the top. So that stitching that I just put in goes along the edge, and I press that. Okay, so now I'm back to my apron here with my pocket, and I need to pay attention to those placement lines that were on my pattern. I did transfer them in a couple of spots to the front of my pattern, so I just have them, you probably can't see them. They're just transferred with fabric pencil. I've got a couple of dashes on either side. So I'm just gonna go ahead and I'm gonna line up the sides of my pocket with those, and then the bottom, my bottom raw edge should be lined up with the bottom raw edge of the apron as well. So I just want to make sure that I'm placing that pocket in with those placement lines, and that's just going to ensure that it is kind of centered on my apron as I do that. So then I can go ahead and I can pin that in place. Okay, once I have that pinned in place here on my apron, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna do a top stitch, and I'm gonna do that 3/8 inch from both sides and from the top. I'm not going to be stitching here or here on the slanted edges, because those are going to be the openings to my pocket, and I do want this to be a functioning pocket. Okay, so I'm not going to be stitching there. I am then going to also do a base stitch 1 inch from the bottom here. So again, that's where we set our machine to a very long stitch. We don't do a back stitch. So just down here, a 1 inch seam allowance and a base stitch. Okay, but the rest of this we will be doing a top stitch, so you want to make sure that you're back stitching, especially because if you want this to be a functioning pocket, you really need to make sure you're back stitching this in place, so that if you put anything that has any kind of weight in here at all, your pocket's not just going to fall right off the apron.